She was not just a judge, she was the system itself. For 25 years she had twisted justice, silenced attorneys, and sent innocent people to prison, all according to plan. The scorching noon sun of Alabama streamed through the barred window of Jackson Prison, reflecting off the pale gray tiles of Courtroom No. 3. The air outside was stifling, but nothing compared to the suffocating atmosphere within, where injustice had seeped into every brick, every grain of wood on the jury bench. At the very center of the room, seated on a tall chair made of polished ebony, Judge Beatrice Calloway exuded authority. Her face was devoid of emotion, but behind her cold, piercing eyes lay the arrogance of absolute power. Her silver hair was neatly pinned up, not a single strand out of place, just like the way she controlled everything in this courtroom. A pair of gold-rimmed glasses rested on her slender nose, allowing her to glance down at those before her with undisguised contempt, as if everyone in the room was beneath her. Every furrowed brow, every smirk of disdain, every deliberate strike of her gavel silenced the courtroom, for everyone knew the rules here, and the rules were written by the absolute power of Judge Beatrice Calloway. Her targets? Those who never stood a chance against the system. She rarely raised her voice. She didn't need to. A slight shake of the head, a casual remark, or simply ignoring a lawyer's argument was enough to decide a person's fate. Imagine this, a young defense attorney stripped of their license within 3 months simply for daring to challenge an unjust verdict. A fellow judge who once questioned one of her rulings, quietly resigning after 6 months. Defendants, especially people of color, walking into this courtroom already knowing their fate. Here, fairness did not exist. Here, she was the law. A rotten system. Shady cases piled up over the years. The wealthy and powerful knew that winning a case only required knowing how to grease the system. Police officers, prosecutors, even witnesses. Everyone had a price. A familiar scene in the courtroom. A young prosecutor, stumbling over falsified documents yet still delivering the indictment, knowing full well who was truly in control of the case. A defense attorney, desperately presenting an alibi only to be cut off by Judge Calloway's indifferent gavel. A defendant, fully aware they had no chance, bowing their head in silent resignation because speaking up would only make things worse. Journalists, human rights activists, they all knew what was happening, but no one dared to challenge her because they knew she had connections in high places. Anyone who opposed her disappeared. No one ever won against Judge Beatrice Calloway. A system built on fear. The ticking clock echoed against the walls, a cruel reminder that time was never on the side of the powerless. At the back of the room, a mother sat trembling, eyes brimming with tears as she watched her 19-year-old son sentenced to 25 years for a crime he did not commit. She knew begging was useless. She knew that if she spoke up, she might disappear into the system too, because this was how Calloway ran everything. Fear, power, silence. The entire city knew it, but no one dared to challenge her. But today, someone would. Today, for the first time in 25 years, someone walked into this courtroom without bowing their head. Today, the storm of justice was about to strike. Justice collapses. The oppressive heat weighed heavily on every brick, but inside Courtroom No. 3, the heat didn't come from the weather. It came from the suffocating air. The injustice that had seeped into every corner, every row of seats. There, seated on the chair, revered like a throne, Judge Beatrice Calloway sat upright, her face expressionless, emotionless, as if she were not human but an entity of absolute power. She didn't need to shout. A glance over her glasses, a slow tap of the gavel, or even a sigh was enough to determine the fate of anyone standing before her. She had never lost, because every game in this courtroom was played by her rules, a crime that cannot be proven. At the defendant's table, Jamal Rivers, a young man with empty eyes, sat motionless. His old suit was too large, the collar frayed, but it didn't matter, because in Beatrice Calloway's eyes he was still just a criminal dressed in a suit. Beside him, lawyer Marcus Bennett, the man who had spent years of his life fighting against people like Calloway, sat with his hands clenched on the table, his teeth gritting so hard his temples throbbed. Jamal was accused of armed robbery, but Marcus knew the case file was full of holes. The surveillance footage was blurry, and the robber was just a dark figure in a hoodie. The evidence. A gun found miles away from the crime scene, with no fingerprints belonging to Jamal. The key witness, Harold Whitmore, an elderly man with a history of taking bribes from the police, had changed his testimony after receiving a mysterious $5,000 bank transfer. This case should have been dismissed from the start. But not in Courtroom No. 3. Not when the one in power is Beatrice Calloway. Justice or a farce? Marcus stood up, his voice steady, unshaken. Your Honor, the new evidence presented by the prosecution was never provided during the investigation. This directly violates Brady v. Maryland. The room fell silent for a moment. A few jurors furrowed their brows. Some reporters typed faster in their notebooks. But up on the bench, Calloway showed no sign of hesitation. Gavel tap. Dismissed. Just 2 words, without any explanation. Marcus clenched his fists. Your Honor, I object. Calloway sighed, as if listening to a child argue stubbornly. Mr. Bennett, I will not allow you to turn this trial into a circus. Everything repeated like it had hundreds of times before. Prosecutor Travis Holden, the young man new to the job, still learning to obey, nodded slightly, ready to continue. Proceed with the argument, Mr. Holden. We don't have time to waste. The entire courtroom felt suffocated, but Marcus Bennett did not. He was prepared for this. The lie exposed. Marcus walked slowly toward the witness stand. His eyes never left Harold Whitmore, the man with trembling hands. The sound of his shoes tapping echoed in the silent space. Mr. Whitmore? His voice deep, drawing the whole room into an unavoidable truth. You swear under oath that you saw Jamal Rivers at the crime scene. Harold swallowed hard, his hands tightly clasped together. I believe I saw him. Believe or know for sure? Marcus raised an eyebrow, leaving the question hanging. Harold licked his lips. No answer. Yet, in your initial report, you stated that you couldn't clearly see the face. Do you remember that? Silence. A few jurors leaned forward. Reporters' pens began moving faster. Perhaps you don't remember, Marcus continued, his tone sharp. But there's one thing you can't forget. That's the $5,000 transferred into your bank account right after you changed your testimony. The room erupted with whispers. A reporter gasped. Prosecutor Holden sweated profusely, and Whitmore stammered. Marcus turned to Calloway, giving a faint smile. So, Your Honor, may I continue, or is this trial no longer important? A shock waved through the courtroom. A few jurors exchanged astonished glances. Prosecutor Travis Holden instinctively swallowed hard, his eyes shifting into panic. And this, Marcus pulled out another stack of documents, is a list of Judge Calloway's questionable rulings over the past 15 years. They all share one thing in common. Every convicted individual was black, despite weak or completely fabricated evidence. The courtroom fell into an eerie silence, as if a storm was about to break. Calloway clenched her fists, her fingers digging into the armrests of her chair, but her voice remained firm. These accusations are baseless. This is slander. You will pay for this, Bennett. But this time, someone disagreed with her. The courtroom doors burst open. 2 men in black suits entered, their FBI badges gleaming under the overhead lights. The entire courtroom held its breath. One of the agents, his face stern, his gaze razor-sharp, pulled out a file and walked straight to the bench. Judge Beatrice Calloway, you are under federal investigation for bribery, judicial manipulation, and abusing your power to wrongfully convict dozens of innocent people. A wave of shock rippled through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled frantically, jurors sat agape, and Prosecutor Travis Holden turned pale, his fingers gripping the stack of documents as if trying to crush them. Marcus locked eyes with Calloway. She stiffened, her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes betraying the fear she desperately tried to conceal. This is outrageous! Calloway shot up from her seat, her hand gripping the gavel. I will not stand for this. This is a political attack. No, ma'am. The FBI agent stepped forward, his voice calm but authoritative. This is justice. Calloway's eyes darted around the room, searching for anyone who might come to her aid. But this time, no one bowed to her. The courtroom officers, who had once obeyed her every command, remained still. The lawyers who once feared her gaze now looked at her with contempt. Even Prosecutor Travis Holden, who had always stood on her side, couldn't bring himself to lift his head. You have used your power to destroy the lives of innocent people. Marcus spoke slowly, each word cutting like a blade. Today, justice no longer belongs to you. The FBI agent stepped forward, pulling out a pair of gleaming steel handcuffs. Beatrice Calloway, you are under arrest. The click of the cuffs snapping shut echoed through the courtroom like the toll of a bell marking the end of a reign of injustice. Calloway stood frozen, as if she had never believed this day would come. Camera flashes erupted, capturing the moment. The most powerful judge in Alabama stepping down from the bench she had ruled over for 25 years. Now, she was just another defendant. Marcus exhaled slowly, a quiet relief settling over him. Beside him, Jamal Rivers looked down at his bare wrists, no longer shackled. Today, justice had prevailed, and this was only the beginning. The liberation of Jamal Rivers. Jackson Courthouse, Alabama. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows of the courthouse, casting long streaks across the polished wooden floor. The air was still heavy, lingering with the remnants of a storm that had swept away Beatrice Calloway's power. But the battle was not over. At the defendant's table, Jamal Rivers remained seated, his bare hands newly freed from shackles. He could hardly believe the sensation. The marks from the cuffs still pressed into his wrists, a reminder of the years he had spent imprisoned for a crime he never committed. And now, all eyes were on prosecutor Travis Holden. The final battle. Travis Holden stood frozen, his face pale, sweat soaking the collar of his shirt. He had never questioned his role before. Every verdict Calloway handed down he had followed without hesitation, but now his shield had crumbled. Calloway was gone. No one was left to manipulate justice for him. Then a deep, firm voice broke the silence. Marcus Bennett. Your Honor, in light of new evidence exposing Judge Beatrice Calloway's corruption, we formally request that all charges against Jamal Rivers be dropped. A deadly silence blanketed the courtroom. Marcus turned to Holden, his gaze sharp as a blade. Prosecutor Holden, do you have anything to say? Holden swallowed hard, his breathing unsteady. His eyes darted over the case files in front of him, but he knew there was nothing left to cling to. He stammered, his voice dry. Marcus's words landed like nails hammering into wood, unyielding, inescapable. Do the right thing, Prosecutor Holden. From the spectator seats, reporters quietly jotted down notes, cameras poised, ready to capture a historic moment. The verdict that restores justice. A heavy sigh filled the room. Travis Holden, once a confident enforcer of Calloway's rulings, now looked smaller than ever. He bit his lip, then lifted his head to the jury and the court. I have no grounds to continue this case. A stir rippled through the courtroom. Some gasped, some couldn't believe their ears, but others, those who had been victims of the system, felt justice shifting in the air. Holden took a deep breath before finally conceding, with the new evidence presented, I formally withdraw all charges against Jamal Rivers. Marcus closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if savoring the victory. Then he turned his gaze toward the judge's bench, where Judge William Harper, newly appointed to replace Calloway, gave a thoughtful nod. With a steady, authoritative voice, Harper declared, "This court hereby finds the defendant, Jamal Rivers, not guilty. His record will be expunged. The final shackles fall." The gavel struck the bench. Jamal stood motionless, eyes wide, as if unable to process the words he had just heard. Jamal, Marcus placed a firm hand on his shoulder, his voice both gentle and powerful. You're free. Jamal swallowed hard, his eyes welling up. He lifted his hands to look at his wrists. No more handcuffs. A court officer stepped forward, carefully unlocking the chains around his ankles. The sound of metal hitting the floor echoed. A sound of liberation. Tears of freedom. And in that moment, the room erupted. From the back row, a woman burst into tears. Jamal's mother. She covered her face, tears streaming down her cheeks. Jamal turned, his gaze locking onto his mother's, and then he stepped forward. They embraced, trembling with relief, as if they had been separated for a lifetime. Around them, applause rang out. A middle-aged man, a former prisoner wrongfully convicted by Calloway, wiped his eyes and murmured, "Finally, justice has arrived." Minutes later, the doors of Jackson Courthouse swung open. Jamal Rivers stepped outside, for the first time in years not wearing a prison uniform. The sunlight bathed his face, and he inhaled deeply, savoring the air of freedom. The sky looked bluer, the world wider than ever before. Marcus followed behind him, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. He had won this battle, but the war was far from over, because there were still many Jamal Rivers out there, and Marcus Bennett wasn't going to stop. Jackson Courthouse, Alabama, 1 week after Judge Beatrice Calloway's arrest. The atmosphere inside Jackson Courthouse had changed. Once, this place had felt like an invisible prison, where the innocent were dragged into trials with their verdicts already decided. But now, everything was different. The old system had crumbled. The officials who had once bowed to Beatrice Calloway, the prosecutors who had collaborated in wrongful convictions, were now desperately trying to conceal their fear. The fallen. Inside a federal detention facility, Beatrice Calloway sat alone, her gaze hollow. Just a week ago, she had stood high on the bench, controlling the fate of others, bending justice to her will. But now, the cold silence of 4 gray walls was all she had left. The cell door creaked open. An FBI agent stepped inside, his face devoid of sympathy. "You have the right to remain silent, but we strongly advise you to cooperate." Calloway let out a dry, bitter chuckle, but the arrogance in her smirk was gone. "What's left to say?" Her voice was hoarse, as if each word carried the weight of inevitable downfall. An investigation far from over. While Calloway faced justice, the FBI continued to widen the investigation. The local police department, the district attorney's office, even private organizations, all were now under strict scrutiny. Arrests mounted quickly. Prosecutors who had worked alongside Calloway, officers who had fabricated evidence, all were being summoned for questioning. In a small, dimly lit room, Marcus Bennett stood before a board covered in photos, case files, and pinned evidence. He could not stop now, because he knew the truth was far more complex than what had already surfaced. The price of complicity. Office of Prosecutor Travis Holden. Travis Holden sat at his desk, his fingers wrapped tightly around a cup of cold coffee. He knew there was no escaping this, even though he had withdrawn the charges against Jamal Rivers, even though he had publicly distanced himself from Calloway, his past could not be erased. The door swung open, an FBI agent stepped inside. "Mr. Holden, you need to come with us. We have some questions regarding your previous cases." Holden didn't argue. He simply sighed heavily and nodded. He had known this day would come. Jamal Rivers, a new beginning. At a small cafe in downtown Jackson, Jamal Rivers sat before a steaming cup of coffee. The atmosphere was calm, yet inside him, unease lingered. He was free, but the scars of wrongful imprisonment still remained. The door opened, and Marcus Bennett walked in, pulling out a chair across from him. "You doing okay?" Jamal shrugged, offering a faint smile. "I think so," but he hesitated, staring out the window. "I'm still not used to it." Marcus nodded. "It'll take time. But you've got your whole life ahead of you." Jamal took a deep breath, for the first time feeling the full weight of freedom. Those who fight for justice. Outside Jackson Courthouse, a group of young lawyers had gathered. They were the ones who had once been threatened, silenced, but now they were standing up to fight for justice. Marcus Bennett approached, his eyes filled with determination. He knew this fight wasn't over. "We took down Calloway, but how many more like her are still out there?" The faces around him were filled with resolve, and for the first time Marcus knew he was no longer alone in this battle. Justice is more than a trial. The fight is far from over. 3 months after Judge Beatrice Calloway was arrested, Jackson, Alabama was still far from peaceful. The justice system seemed to have been cleansed of corruption, but the shadows of past injustices still lingered. In every street corner, in every prosecutor's office, in every prison cell where innocent people still waited for their chance to be free. Marcus Bennett knew this, and he had no intention of stopping. On yacht, in a small office on the city's main street, Marcus sat before a towering stack of case files, each one as heavy as the weight on his chest. "How many more cases do we have?" Across from him, Hannah Torres sat with tired eyes, but the fire of determination still burned within them. Too many. She pushed a folder toward Marcus. The bold names on the file covers told the stories of lives crushed under Calloway's corrupt rule. Darnell Green, sentenced to 20 years for a robbery with no witnesses. Lisa Montrose, accused of fraud despite no credible financial evidence. Eric Vaughn, framed in a drug case based solely on the testimony of a cop who was later investigated for corruption. Marcus closed his eyes for a brief moment, inhaling deeply to suppress the rising anger. Each name on this list was a stolen life. We won't let them be forgotten. His voice was firm, unwavering. Hannah nodded. They had done it once with Jamal Rivers, and they would do it again for others. Jamal Rivers, from victim to warrior. At a small cafe near the law office, Jamal Rivers sat across from a middle-aged man. The man's eyes were heavy with exhaustion and bitterness, the look of someone who had once believed in the system, only to be betrayed by it. I heard you were wrongfully imprisoned. The man's voice was dry and weary. Jamal nodded. 12 years. A heavy silence settled between them. Finally, the man whispered, "They took 15 years from me." His fingers clenched around his coffee cup, knuckles turning white. Jamal knew that feeling, the feeling of not knowing if you would ever be whole again. I can't go back and change the past. Jamal's voice was steady. But I can help you take back your future. The man looked up, suspicion in his eyes, but also hope. And in that moment, Jamal knew he had found his purpose. Travis Holden facing the past. In a small suburban apartment, Travis Holden sat in darkness, his computer screen illuminating the pages of case files he had once prosecuted. Each line of text was a blade slicing through his conscience. How many times had he ignored the truth? How many times had he let an innocent person be convicted just to avoid standing against the system? If only I had known sooner. He muttered, then let out a bitter laugh. Would it have changed anything? He had let too many people suffer. But there was still something he could do. Travis took a deep breath, opened a new email, and started typing. Marcus, I have a list of cases I believe were mishandled. We need to meet. And, for the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something right. The courtroom, where justice must be defined. Inside Courtroom No. 4, the tension was suffocating. All eyes were on Marcus Bennett, standing before a new judge, a new prosecutor. But the story remained the same. Marcus raised a stack of files, his gaze sharp like a soldier stepping onto the battlefield. Your Honor, I am not just here for my client. I am here for every person who has been buried under wrongful convictions. The click of camera shutters filled the room. Reporters scribbled notes furiously. We cannot keep pretending this system is flawless. We cannot continue to turn a blind eye to the truth. Across the room, the prosecutor flipped through the files, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. Marcus felt the shift in the courtroom. People were listening to him. And more importantly, they believed him. A new path forward. As Marcus stepped out of the courtroom that day, he knew this fight was far from over. But this time, he wasn't fighting alone. Jamal stood beside him, his eyes filled with fire. Hannah held a new list of cases, their next battle. Travis approached, a small but certain sign that he had chosen the right side. They couldn't change the system overnight, but they could start today, and they would not stop. Justice still needs those who stand up and fight. In life, there are injustices so deeply rooted in society that many people accept them, believing this is just the way things are. But the story of Marcus Bennett and Jamal Rivers reveals an important truth. Justice does not come naturally. It requires people who are willing to stand up, fight, and refuse to back down in the face of corrupt power. Any one of us may find ourselves in situations where fairness is trampled upon. It could be an unfair decision at work, an injustice in the community, or even small acts of wrongdoing in everyday life. But the most important thing is not to accept or stay silent. It is to speak up for the truth and defend what is right. This story is not just about overturning the rulings of a corrupt judge. It is a reminder that change begins with those who are brave enough to step forward. We may not all be lawyers or judges, but we have a voice, thoughts, and a responsibility to stand for justice. If you believe the truth matters, leave a comment below. Have you ever witnessed or experienced injustice? Share your story so we can stand together and make our voices heard. And don't forget to like and follow the channel because the fight for justice is far from over.